So now let me hand over the microphone to him. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Good afternoon. This session is about Japan and Korea. As you know, Japanese economy has experienced low growth and inflation over a quarter of century. And also Korea's economic performance has been disappointing for last decade. Especially Korea's economic growth rate has been less than 3% over the past 5 years. So natural concerns emerge that Korea may be another Japan. So I really hope this session is an excellent opportunity to share your wisdom. For this session, we have an hour and 40 minutes minus. I would like each speaker to spend 20 minutes or so, and each discussant to spend 10 minutes. I think I have to introduce very briefly, although, this gentleman. Now, Dr. Adams Paulson. He is currently president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Before he joined the institute, he worked for Fed New York. And he was appointed as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. And the Professor Masahiro Kawai will discuss Dr. Paulson's presentations. He is a professor at University of Tokyo. Before he returned to the university, he served as a CEO and dean of the ADBI, arm of the ADB. He also worked for Brookings and taught at Johns Hopkins. And Professor Kyoji Kugao, he's a professor at the Institute of Economic Research at the Tsubashi University, and the program director and faculty fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade, and Industry. His expertise is productivity, international economics, and economic history. Dr. Jonathan Wurzel, who will discuss Professor Fukawa's presentations, is a senior partner at McKinsey and Company. He is also Asia-based director of the McKinsey Global Institute. He's an expert on energy sustainability and economic master planning. He has advised many governments in Asia and actively serves urban authorities in the Middle East, China, Russia, and North America. Dr. Dong-Chul Cho, he currently is a member of the Monetary Policy Board of the Bank of Korea. He used to be a chief economist at the Korea Development Institute and professor at the KBI School of Public Policy and Management. He served as many advisory work for Korean government. His major areas of interest include macroeconomics and international finance. Lastly, Dr. Tarhan Feizioglu. He's a division chief in the Asia and Pacific Department of the IMF. Before Dr. Feizioglu joined the IMF in 1996, he taught at Georgetown University and worked for the World Bank. Okay, let's go, gentlemen.
Hello again. Sorry to be back. I wish I had taken the athletic managing director Lagarde's advice and worked on my fitness. Joking aside, I fear I will be boring because my remarks will obviously minimize contradiction with my earlier remarks, but I will take it from there. I owe, in addition to that apology to the audience, an apology to my colleague and discussant, Professor Kawai. I delivered the slides very late, and he is being very gracious about it. Let me get back to substance. It used to be a big game to talk about who was turning Japanese. So back in 2003, I did a paper called "Is Germany Turning Japanese?" There have been various ones since. We're going to get a paper from the deputy governor, which looks very analytically at the question of how far along Korea is in parallel to Japan. But I feel like this has gotten distorted as much as I was a contributor to this literature. And I think what we need to look at is not so much countries turning Japanese as Japan and all the other countries returning to reality. This is, in a sense, a much shorter time horizon version of Joel Mokir's earlier presentation, that there was an old bad world and the unusual. We're past the unusual in Japan. So people talk about Japan having 2 lost decades, and I believe Hiroshi Nakaso is here somewhere. He can provide more facts on this. But there really are 2 different periods. There is the period from 1990 to 2002, in which, in my and many other people's view, a recession was continually prolonged and deepened by a set of idiosyncratic Japan-specific shocks, many of which were due to policy. But then we have a long period, starting with the Koizumi administration and the bank cleanup, you can date it late 2002, early 2003, to the present, in which, while everyone still keeps thinking Japan is doing terribly, actually Japan has pretty decent per capita growth, and it, as when people are now beginning to recognize, it is suffering from problems that are actually pretty general to the advanced economies. And the fact is, even there was mention by Madame Lagarde and others about the slowdown in productivity growth, but if you keep comparing Japan to its peer set of other G7 economies, including my former homes, the US and the UK, actually Japan doesn't look that bad. So I'd like to raise 3 issues. First, does Japan still demonstrate that basically what we had right was the undergraduate macro textbooks of the 1980s or 1990s? And I think the answer is yes. So when we talk about macro stabilization, fiscal policy, a lot of basic macro still applies. I know Anna is going to give us a paper on fiscal policy later and a longer-term perspective. Second, I think, and this relates to something I said earlier, and again, I apologize for repeating, but it's an interesting question that the apparent failure to raise the inflation rate in Japan, how much does this really matter? And I think it does matter less than many of us, myself included, thought it would. And that it's very puzzling from an academic perspective, and there's very good research to be done there, but from a short-term or even medium-term policy perspective, we should probably be less concerned. And third, going out a bit more on a limb, I want to talk a bit about political economy. What did it mean to turn Japanese, the recurrent mistakes of the late 90s, early 2000s, and how applicable is that to Asia generally? And of course, as we keep saying, and as these case study panels will illustrate amply, even Japan and Korea differ a little bit. And we start talking about Indonesia and India and the wealth and diversity of Asia, it becomes very different. But I still think there are some general issues. So another way to put this is, in terms of macro, what's gone on with Abeomics? And I think the first thing that has to be said is we had the tax hike in 2014, which was a fiscal tightening, and it had a huge impact. And the monetary expansion has seemingly had relatively low impact. How weird is this? How important is this? Well, I think the people, and I don't mean to upset certain people in the audience who I know are here, but people who took DSGE models seriously were more upset about this than those of us who were working in sort of markets and policy in a different space. Because ultimately, if you don't believe in very long forward-looking behavior and don't take too literally issues of central bank credibility, you never got into the Mike Woodford mental game that everything was about expectations. And so you start thinking about things in a much more structural, admittedly partial equilibrium way. And so, for example, the yen pass-through to inflation, the very large and sustained depreciation in the yen against the dollar, did not have a significant ongoing impact on inflation. And you could, for one thing, say, well, that's because inflation expectations were anchored. But it also, I think, had to do with structural issues, which I know the IMF has worked on, about where Japan sits in the international division of labor, the consumption habits of the middle class in Japan, how the supply chains work. And by analogy, we can see in the UK, where a sustained depreciation of sterling has not translated into very large swings in inflation. And then when you talk about the surprise about the VAT hike having such a big impact, this relates to arguments I was making in 1998, and others have made, much more prominent people have made since, that you know, in the end, if you don't take seriously ideas of Ricardian equivalence and you don't take seriously ideas, notions, I would say, not just ideas, that current day households take into account the public debt, it shouldn't surprise you that a relatively closed economy like Japan is going to have very large multipliers on the fiscal shocks, especially in 2013-14 when you're coming out of a recession. But most of all, I think it's important to recognize that there are this whole set of things going on in Japan more recently that are common across the advanced economies. Low wage growth, low response of imports to depreciation, no stable short-run Phillips curve. Now, we can have a debate about whether there's no stable short-run Phillips curve or whether there's a really well-defined Phillips curve with a slope of almost zero. And that's actually not a trivial debate. And our colleague at Peterson, Olivier Blanchard, is writing about that, and many other people are writing about that. But we certainly don't have the steep Phillips curve that monetary theorists had promised us was the promised land when you had credible monetary policy. And most stunningly of all, of course, Japan continues to rack up public debt and long rates don't go up. And that turned out to not be idiosyncratic to Japan. That turns out to be something we've seen in other countries as well. So I think one of the most important things we have to do is think harder about the labor market dynamics. And as Blanchard and I wrote about a few years ago, that the real source of inflation has to be a wage price spiral. I'm very delighted that Professor Fukao is contributing a paper focusing on this, and he'll come up next. I think it's interesting to think about right now composition effects in the workforce. So some of you probably didn't notice this, but some of you may have, that the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco recently came out with a paper looking at wage inflation in the US, in which they said, wow, there's a big compositional effect. Part of the reason the aggregate wage number isn't moving up is we've got, going to Joel's point about the retirement, we've got all these older, potentially very productive, but very well-paid people retiring. We've got young people coming in the workforce. And so even if the young people are getting raises on net, you don't see much wage growth. And arguably, there is something of this effect in Japan, which relates, of course, to the fact that we've had this marvelous increase in female labor force participation. And again, my colleagues on the panel or Hiroshi can give you as much detail, but I think it's always important to remind people the scale of this. Roughly 1 million women have entered the workforce in the last 3 years on a workforce of roughly 50 million. And this was all in response to some actually not terribly large incentive changes. Now again, a lot of the women entering the workforce in Japan, they're part-time, they have low attachment, they're certainly underpaid, there's certainly still sexism. All that, for better or for worse, is part and parcel of increasing female labor force participation. We saw that in Eastern Europe and in the Nordic countries. But the fact is, then it gets you into these compositional effects of you suddenly have a bunch of women coming in, and from a productivity point of view, this is probably good because the best women are the ones most likely coming back into the workforce, and they best from a productivity standpoint, of course. And they are presumably displacing or complementing some men who are in jobs they were underqualified for. And so it's a boost for productivity, but it's also deflationary, or at least its impulse is deflationary. And so I think it's important to see this again as something generally happening. One of the aspects of demographic change and ideally of increasing female labor force participation is, of course, doesn't explain everything. We've seen a decline in female labor force participation in the US in recent years, very marked. Seems to be driven mostly by demographics. Certainly hasn't been consistent with rising wages, but there is a factor here that has to be taken into account. And I'm going to skip the rest of the slide in the interest of time, but just to say that increasing labor supply has these interesting effects. It has to be seen as, in the short run, disinflationary or deflationary. And again, this is not a Japan-specific thing. We saw in Germany that the major labor market reforms in 2003, that they changed various incentives for labor supply, not to have men dropping out in late mid-career, at high rates of replacement for their wages, and it initially was pushing downward on wages, and it took until there was a strong recovery in Germany in the mid-2000s before you saw the benefits. This is something we have to generally take into account. Now, I've already beaten up some on standard monetary policy, as my colleague from the Bank of Korea committee raised, but I think it is worth remembering, and here I think my friend Deputy Governor Nakaso may disagree with me, but it is worth remembering that the Bank of Japan, since the new leadership came in April of 2013, has done essentially everything a inflationista like me or Paul Krugman or even now Ben Bernanke would have asked them to do. They've coordinated with the government, they've announced a positive inflation target, they've bought long-term bonds rather than short-term bonds, they have let the exchange rate go, they have, to really nutty people, compromised independence, not really, but it looks like it. Whatever it is you want them to have done, they've pretty much done it, and we've not seen huge inflation. That's not an attack on the BOJ, it is an attack on these models that suggest that inflation is easily restarted, and it's an attack on these models that credibility of central banks can easily be lost and will immediately translate into fast inflation. I think fiscal policy has been less surprising, but there still are questions. Again, we'll have a paper on some of these issues later, more broadly, how you think about fiscal space from our colleagues at the IMF. But there is this fundamental disjunction, which is not specific to Japan, that we are not seeing major moves of interest rates in response to public debt levels. And it's not even in response to obvious amounts of foreign debt levels. And so we're not just disproving Reinhard Rogoff's mythical 90% as a tipping point. There doesn't seem to be a tipping point. Now, again, one can say, well, that's a question of the context, and everybody's doing it at the same time, and so the US is doing it, so rates are low. And agree, that must have some part of it, but I think there is room there for a fundamental rethink. And if we go back to the thinking about the Asian growth model, the former one and the coming one, let us not forget that both Japan and China, as well as some other Asian economies, share one attribute at least, which is they have done a lot of public investment. Now, and a lot of it is arguably quite wasteful by sort of project-by-project standards, but it has not shown up as inflation, and it has not shown up as a problem. I think the other thing that I would just emphasize, that was the fourth point on this slide, but the first point on this slide is the one other thing I would say. We had the discussion in Japan, started by Richard Koo, among others, of the idea of a balance sheet recession. And we talked about that again in the Western context coming out of the financial crisis, and I think there's a lot of explanatory power from that. But then it is worth remembering that the corporate sector in Japan has been rebuilding balance sheets for nearly 20 years now. And the household sector in Japan has been slowly taking down savings, but basically in line with Charles Horioka and others' long-term demographic projections of why savings should go down as you get older. In other words, we've got quite solid balance sheets in various places in the Japanese economy, and that improvement does not seem to have changed the partial derivative, the multiplier, the response. I'm sorry, jet lag is making me muddle words. The response to an impulse of any kind, a lower interest rate or whatever, and that's quite striking to worry about. So we're running out of time, so let me just go to the last point, which is, so how do we think about the political economy of reform and growth if inflation is not as big a deal as we think, if labor market reform is disinflationary, if fiscal policy seems to work in ways we understand in the short run but not in the long run? How should we think about this? And again, I would suggest this is not so much turning Japanese as everybody's reverting back to an old normal. And as I said in response to the question earlier, and Blanchard and Galley, for example, had an early paper on this, the US was just sort of aberrant in the early 2000s. Arguably the UK was, or a nice word for it was lucky. If you look at Italy, if you look at the UK, if you look around Asia, now in Korea, a lot of the same phenomena are occurring. So 15 years ago, 14 years ago, I suggested there was a sort of stagnation model of political economy, that you have incomplete financial liberalization, you have a divided macro policy where fiscal and monetary policy cannot cooperate, you have households that are passive financially and politically, and you have a lack of openness. And that this combination was what made Japan distinctive and have this recurring problem throughout the 90s into the mid-2000s. And to make my argument quick, essentially Germany had a couple of these but was saved by the EU. It was forced to be more open, it was forced to be more responsive, it was forced to, against its will, kicking and screaming, have better coordinated monetary and fiscal policy, and so on. Now, so that then raises the question for other countries and economies in Asia, if you start falling into the trap of repressing savings, of having financial liberalization limited so your savers cannot exit or provide voice on the government, if you have overly separated monetary and fiscal policy, is there enough openness, is there enough integration in Asia to turn it around? And so here again, I hadn't realized I was going to do this, but in a sense I'm echoing Joe Mulcair on a much shorter time scale. The point of openness in the end isn't just about the direct, I say isn't just economic, what I really mean isn't about the direct benefits and issues of trade and finance and some of the things that Olivier and Lee spoke about earlier. It's also essentially about how entrenched your incumbents and your interest groups get in civil society, how much of an ethno-nationalist preference you have. And so I have an old hobby horse that I probably don't need to ride anymore, that I always hated, the person Tabellini, Alesina kind of political economy that suggested if we just imported Swedish institutions into Italy, everything would be fine. That isn't what happened. That isn't what worked. And I think it's important we retain that. That doesn't mean you blame everything on culture, but it means that you have to accept that there are entrenched interest groups. And so part of the point of openness is to push those interest groups out. And in an unrelated set of work, our colleague Marcus Noland and Howard Pack did a study of foreign direct investment openness and polling data, and what you find is that all these things about globalization in, for example, the Middle East are driven by attitudes about openness. It's not purely about economics. And so I think that is where I want to end this, that Japan, to the degree it pulls itself out and the degree alternatively it remains an exception, is not just about the economics, and in fact is less about the economics, it's about its openness. Thank you very much.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event to invite me and make comments on Adam Posen's presentation. I'm very happy to do this. The only thing is that I got his PowerPoint this morning, and my PowerPoint was not quite ready. So you don't have it in your hand. My apology. Assuming that most of the audience, people here know about Japan, I'm not going to explain the background, but just a few words. Well, Japan today faces major structural issues: low potential growth and persistently low inflation. I included as sort of part of a structural because it's so persistent, okay? And population decline and aging, mounting public sector debt. So these are the issues that Adam wanted to tackle. So he asks several important questions. Does Abeomics support or discredit a standard macroeconomic approach to growth? My answer is that yes, it does support a standard macroeconomic approach, but with some significant caveats. Okay? And a second question, how relevant to growth and welfare are the puzzles of the apparent inability to raise inflation? I think the puzzle of a persistent low inflation rate is a significant phenomenon. So my answer is that yes, it is quite relevant. Okay? I want to come back this issue. What is the political economy of raising the growth rate, and how applicable is that to Asia generally? This issue is the fundamental issue because if you want to create inflation, then immediately you encounter various problems. And some of the instruments, like the low interest rate policy, has already faced various issues, like the banking sector did complain of the low or negative interest rate policy. And if the inflation rate goes up before wages go up, then the general public can raise voice, and politicians become a bit nervous about this inflationary policy. So this political economy issue is a very important issue. And Adam raises several issues, and I put my quick responses in red. Clean banks and balance sheets have had limited effects in Japan in expanding bank loans because of low demand for corporate investment. The underlying investment demand is low. Having said that, bank loans have been rising, not at a remarkable rate, but at 1.5%, 2% recently. Monetary policy, whether expectations are dominated by forward-looking expectations, looks like looking at Japan, expectations seem to be dominated by backward-looking or adaptive expectations because of deep-rooted deflationary mind on the part of firms and consumers. This is a very significant problem. Global forces like energy prices and various shocks, Brexit shocks, geopolitical shocks, and so forth, have been quite important in the case of Japan in addressing low inflation problem. And low inflation is inertial because of, once again, deep-rooted deflationary mind and lack of rapid wage rises. And behind this, there are some structural issues. I want to come back to that. Exchange rate pass-through, I think exchange rate pass-through worked relatively well up to a point. But then from the second part of, in particular 2015, the energy prices and other shocks started to put reverse pressure. I got the impression that Adam thought that the fiscal credibility issue, fiscal sustainability issue may not be so important in Japan. I think, in my view, that's very, very, very important. If, given the very large size of of the public sector debt. The market has not responded yet, but maybe it's a bit too late if the market responds. So a lot of precautionary measures would be needed. Structural reforms are key to raising productivity. Structural reforms have not led to significant improvements, so are structural reforms important? That was a question raised by Adam. I say structural reforms are key. And working with the neighboring countries like China and Korea is very important for greater Asian integration. So these are my quick responses. I'm not sure how much time I have, but do I have 5 more minutes or so? Or? Okay. I have 30 slides, which I really prepared because I did not know how, what sort of presentation Adam would make. But let me show you several graphs, and I want to talk about the slow wage growth phenomenon and also trade issue. There was a collapse of banking sector loans, but recently banking sector loans have been recovering. So now it's maybe around 3%. And deleveraging of private corporations was a very significant phenomenon that put huge negative pressure on the Japanese economy. And Japanese investment, in particular net investment, declined very sharply as a ratio of GDP. So that's really Japanization. And during the 2 decades, I would divide the entire period into 2, not according to the way that Adam does, but the first half was a result of a failure to tackle the post-bubble stagnation. After the bursting of the bubble, the Japanese policymakers failed to adequately respond and contain. And that was about the first 10 years, or 10 plus years. And then, after that, population aging really started to kick in. And then for the whole period, productivity slowdown took place. So Japan's structural issues, potential growth based on the BOJ's estimates, the Cabinet Office estimates, and the Bank of Japan's estimates, you can see that the potential growth rate declined to almost 0 in the first half of 2000s, and then started to come back. It's now 0.8%, which is better than before. Hopefully, this would further go up. Population aging, public debt. No. So deep-rooted deflationary mind, like the corporate sector, even if they accumulate large retained earnings, the corporate sector has not been spending retained earnings for higher wages to workers or for higher prices to suppliers. Big companies have supply chains. So suppliers have also suffered for a long time, even though material prices rose as a result of yen depreciation. The retained earnings have been held. That reflects a deflationary mind. And just one word on Abeomics. It's an excellent combination from, I think, standard economists' point of view. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural reform in the face of stagnant economies. Of course, fiscal policy has to be consistent with the long-term fiscal sustainability. And G20 adopts basically the three arrows at the global level. So Abeomics has achieved, the biggest achievement is an increase in nominal GDP, which was not quite obtained before. After Mr. Kuroda came, nominal GDP started to grow. And looking at the composite index, the Japanese economy has been expanding for some years. So there is a good sign. Labor market is now very tight, getting very, very tight. But the inflation rate has not achieved 2%. Achieving the 2% target is very, very important because the US has 2% target. ECB has close to 2% target. So if Japan has, say, 1% target, then Japan would be always under currency appreciation pressure, which would be deflationary. So 2% is extremely important. So I want to just in a minute, this deep-rooted deflationary mind and slow, low wage increase. So even though firms are accumulating large retained earnings and labor market has been tight, the pace of wage rises has been slow. There are several reasons. One is labor market structure. It's a structural problem. The number of irregular workers has been expanding over the past 20 years and has become a very relatively large, about 40% of the total labor market. And wages of these irregular workers have been rising relatively fast. But the core part of the labor market for the regular workers, regular worker wages have not been rising because regular workers enjoy greater job security and non-wage benefits. So they would be happy by being just regular workers. So what this means is that once the relative size of irregular workers shrinks by firms moving some irregular workers to regular workers, more wage pressure will be eventually created. I think it's a matter of time. And also firms are investing in labor-saving technologies to avoid wage increases, which means labor productivity is rising. This is according to the analysis of BOJ. So again, it will be a matter of time for this to be translated into higher wage increases. I think it's a matter of time, but these structural issues are preventing rapid wage increases. My final word on FTA challenge for Japan. So TPP, Mr. Trump withdrew from TPP. So Japan and other TPP member countries, TPP 11 countries have been negotiating on how to implement TPP. And they are now in the process of identifying what minimum changes can be done. So once they agree on those, I'm sure TPP 11 would be implemented. And Japan and EU broadly agreed on the EPA, sorry, not FPA, EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, which is very good news. And of course, Japan as members of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and CJK, FDA, they are negotiating. But my personal view is that these would be concluded after the conclusion of TPP 11 negotiations, which is expected to take place later in the fall this year. And to negotiate bilateral FTA with the US, if the US really insists on bilateral FTA. But again, this would be likely after the conclusion of TPP 11 negotiations. Thank you very much.
So already the distinguished presenters, Adam and Kawai sensei, Professor Kawai, already discussed about Japan, but I talk mainly about labor market issue in Japan. And this figure shows Japan compares labor productivity level between US and Japan. And the vertical axis shows labor productivity per working hour in US dollars in 2012 prices. And the dotted line shows US labor productivity. And the plain red line shows Japan's labor productivity measured by purchasing power parity of OECD. And the dotted line is based on Japan's labor productivity based on market exchange rate. In 2012, just before Abeomics, yen was so expensive, the exchange rate was, I think, 80 yen per US dollar. So it was much higher than PPP level. But even that very expensive yen, Japan's labor productivity was lower than the US. And if we apply present exchange rate, 110 yen, that is almost same as PPP level now. Then there is about 30% labor productivity gap between Japan and US. And we can see that there is a kink of labor productivity growth in Japan around 1990. And after that, the catching up stopped, or a little bit divergence occurred between US and Japan. Krugman argued that per capita GDP growth after 2000 of Japan is almost same level as US. But as Adam already pointed out, labor force participation rate in Japan increased a lot after 2000. So if we measure labor productivity, Japan's labor productivity growth was much lower than per capita GDP growth. So from the viewpoint of labor productivity growth, Krugman is not correct, and there is a kind of divergence occurs after 1990. And there are a lot of papers on why Japan's labor productivity growth slowed down, and probably two factors: insufficient final demand, excess saving problem, and slow total factor productivity growth. And these two causes are closely related to each other. The slowdown of TFP growth will decrease private investment, something like that. And already Kawai-san pointed out, Japan introduced Abeomics. Abeomics 1 was conducted from early 2013 to September 2015. And first arrow, the monetary easing worked well. Japan succeeded to depreciate our currency from 120 yen to, 80 yen per dollar to 120 yen. And also second arrow, fiscal stimulus worked well. So now Japan GDP gap is almost zero, and the labor market is, as Kawai-san pointed out, very tight now. But in the case of third arrow, growth strategy, it didn't work well. The TFP level didn't improve at all after 2012. This data is based on Conference Board Total Economy database. So from 2015, October, government introduced second phase of Abeomics. And it is so-called Ichioku So katsuyaku. It's in Japanese. The translation is all 100 million playing an active role. Very vague name of the policy, but it is basically strong support for child rearing and social security and labor market policies. So now Japanese government focus more on labor market issues these days. And I would like to talk about why many Japanese scholars and government think labor market is so important. So I talk about two issues. One is already, Adam and Professor Kawai pointed out, non-regular employment problem. And second is productivity and wage gaps between large and small firms. So first issue is Japan's non-regular employment problem. And this figure shows percentage of part-time workers by sector. So you can see that both non-manufacturing, non-market economy, and non-manufacturing market economy, and manufacturing, the percentage of part-time workers increased a lot. And in the case of service sector, it's about 30%. And because Japan's training and accumulation of human capital depends on especially vocational training, depends on training for full-time workers, regular workers. So Japanese firms' expenditure for training declined substantially partly because of part-time workers' increase. And this figure shows labor force participation rate by age and status in employment in the case of male workers. And you can see that both in the young workers in their 20s and old workers like me after 60, the part-time workers are majority are increasing, and large part, and even university graduates. Many of university graduates became part-time workers in their 20s, according to recent study. And this is the case of female workers. Now Japan, lot of elder female works, so labor participation rate of Japan of female workers is not now lower than other developed economies, almost same level as US. But the problem is majority of female workers are part-time workers. So human capital is not accumulated well. And it seems that firms are increasing the number of non-regular employees in order to maintain the flexibility of employment levels. And given the decline of the working age population and economic stagnation, most firms cannot expect their need for employees to steadily increase, as was the case during the high-speed growth era. At the same time, areas in which individual firms have a competitive advantage over their rivals are changing quickly, like Toshiba, NEC, these companies. And given the high job security provided under traditional lifetime employment practices, increasing the reliance on non-regular employees is almost the only way for Japanese firms to keep both the level and the mix of employment flexible. So Japanese lifetime employment system was created during the Second World War and became quite popular across firms in Japan's high-speed growth era. But and it played an important role for accumulation of human capital. But now, under the slow population decline and slow economic growth, it's impossible to keep lifetime employment system for most of workers. And using the employer-employee matched data as a factory level, our team estimated the marginal productivity of worker and compared that with wage payment. And we found that productivity gap between non-regular employees and regular employees is larger than the wage gap. So this means that non-regular workers are not exploited, but they get a premium for supplying flexibility to firms. Such behavior by firms is quite rational in the context of the slow economic growth and Japan's system of high job security. However, at the same time, it may also be creating a huge economic growth by reducing human capital accumulation. This figure compares labor cost, wage level, between regular workers and non-regular workers by age. And we can see huge gap. Even after controlling education level, etc., we have very large wage gap. And according to several works, not only ours, but also there are two additional works, shows this almost corresponds with productivity gap. Well, productivity gap is greater. So that means there might be a, 5 minutes, okay, I should be hurry. There might be a huge loss. So what do we need? What labor market reform we need? To resolve the non-regular employment problem, simply prohibiting non-regular employment would not be the appropriate policy response, because that will make a huge misallocation of workers among firms. On the other hand, reducing the job security of regular workers and improving the social security net would also not be an appropriate policy response, because Japan's human capital accumulation depends on lifetime employment system. So just flexible labor market might slow down accumulation of human capital. So Japan needs to reform the labor market, focusing on the following two aspects simultaneously. First, Japan needs to enhance labor market flexibility, but also, second, Japan needs to enhance human capital accumulation among workers who do not participate in the lifetime employment system. So here are some proposals or promising policies, but because of limit of time, I skip to discuss about the detail. And also, it is important that many female workers answers in government survey, many female workers answers that they choose to be part-time workers in order to have enough time for their family. So Japan's regular workers is too busy, like soldier, and cannot take care of family. So female, especially female workers, choose to be part-time workers. So to make these female workers to be regular workers, Japan needs to increase life-work balance also. And also, especially highly educated full-time female workers, the age of first marriage is increasing recent years. So this problem is closely related with Japan's low fertility rate issue. And yeah, I will skip this. Using, say, 4 or 5 minutes, I will talk about productivity and wage gaps between large and small firms. And labor productivity difference between small and, this figure shows labor productivity difference between small and large firms in Japan and other countries. And we can see that Japan, there is a huge labor productivity gap between small and large firms. So we did, using labor accounting approach, we decomposed labor productivity gap between firm size group, group of different firm size, decompose it to labor quality. Labor quality, we calculate basically Jorgensen-Grilikas type index. So we take account of education and so college graduate, etc., and age and sex, and capital intensity, and as residual, we can calculate TFP gap. And this is the result. In the case of the total market economy, there is a huge productivity gap. Productivity gap is shown by dotted line. So about 80% or 70% difference. And most of productivity gap comes from caused by capital intensity. But we can also see that huge TFP gap. And labor quality gap is not large and it's declining. That is partly because part-time workers are increasing in large firms. And the plain line shows wage gap. And wage gap is also very large, 50% higher in large firms. Large firms here, firms with more than 1,000 workers. And small firm here is firms with less than 100 workers. And in the case of medium and small size firms comparison, there is not much difference. So firms with more than 1,000 employees are special. They have much higher labor productivity. And in Japan market economy, about only 1/3 of workers are employed by large firms. So 2/3 workers are under this very low labor productivity, low wage situation. So by sector, we can find a similar result. And so what causes firm size wage differences, which cannot be explained by Jorgensen-Grillikas approach? And one explanation is rents, but rents cannot continue 30 years. So probably it is not so plausible. And another explanation is large firms' job training, and it is probably plausible. The other explanation is in Japan, graduates of top-ranked universities are much more likely to get a job at a large firm than other graduates. So just Jorgensen-Grillikas type college graduate, high school graduate, that kind of measurement is not enough. We should take account of what university graduate. So, I mean, there is a kind of labor quality difference among like university graduates. And that is difficult to measure. And if we assume that the whole part of firm size wage differences, which is not explained by standard Jorgensen-Grillikas type approach, is caused by difficult to measure labor quality differences, almost all of firm size TFP differences can be explained by this factor. So 50% wage gap, if we can assume that that reflects labor quality difference, then that means 30% TFP gap. So we can explain 30% TFP gap we have observed by labor quality, which is difficult to measure. If this hypothesis is correct, this would imply that there might be large room to improve Japan's macro-level TFP by improving the quality of workers in SMEs through education and training. So as I said, 2/3 of Japan's workers works at SMEs, and their labor quality is, say, 50% lower than large firms. Then by improving that, of course, we need a lot of resources and policies, but there is a kind of huge potential or frontier in Japan to improve our labor productivity. So I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. My comments on Dr. Fukawa's excellent and very focused and enlightening paper are going to largely support the thesis, but I perhaps will elaborate a little bit both from a micro perspective, which is of course what McKinsey does, and also from a comparative one as well. I think the frame that we started looking at the Japanese economy well, back in the 2000s, and then about 2 years ago came up with an updated report was simply saying that that there are challenges and that the, quote, safe and protected society is at risk economically, at risk socially, and that this is so therefore an opportune moment to revisit some of the hypotheses on which the economy had been based. So, as was said, we sort of all see the same picture. Labor productivity gaps growing, and pretty much across the board. Looking here at by sector versus the United States, 2000, 2005, 2011. Again, in a fairly across the board conversation about this gap, and equally true looking at capital productivity as well. The projection was steady state. This will just get worse. So the gap between, again, the U.S. and Japan growing from 29% in 2011 and 2010 up to 37% by 2025. And this is all just in sort of the spirit of setting the context. Where is this coming from? We would add, if we look at the micro side, that there's clearly, first of all, a set of competitive factors. So as we look at investments, we note that in R&D, where you would expect to see a relationship between R&D investments and productivity growth. In fact, for the case of Japan, not so much. High levels, amongst the world's highest levels of R&D spend, but relatively lagging productivity growth. So you ask yourself, why? And so you can go and get down to the firm level and start looking at issues of proprietary standards, of the lack of interoperability, the inability to share a supply chain. So simply, this money is being spent and respent and spent again on expenditures within the firm, and it's simply less productive R&D. I think that there is a characteristic of industry structure which seems to make that spending much less effective in creating new products and services. Another factor you might think about is scale. And sort of like in principle, one should see when one increases scale some returns in terms of productivity, and sort of reductions in the growth of cost of goods sold as you grow as a format. So here in the case of retail, what we're seeing is that yes, there are certainly some fast-growing formats, and drugstores have been growing pretty fast, and specialties and convenience store chains have been growing pretty fast. But none of that has translated into the kind of efficiencies that we've seen in the case of non-store, so manufacturing. So there's clearly, at the firm level again, some barriers to capturing the benefits of scale, whether that's, in the case of retail, issues around supply chain. But we know there have been movement, of course, that the large store retail law was passed, so that was a step towards allowing the growth, but we didn't translate that into a revision of outlooks on real estate ownership. So we look at what the opportunity is. You'll see that Japanese retail owns far more meters squared than it really should. And again, supply chain's quite inefficient. 75% of IT spend is on maintenance of existing systems. So it's quite clearly a system which has failed to sort of take the next step past growth to capture the productivity benefits of that growth. And then globalization. Clearly ones that you think that historically Japan had and has had great global success. But we note that in many important manufacturing sectors, first of all, the Japanese market is entirely dominated by the Japanese manufacturers, and that the Japanese market itself, of course, is not growing as fast as the rest of the world, and as a result, these manufacturers, having relied on the domestic market, are starting to lose ground globally as well. So there's a sort of question of how quickly and how could they revisit the opportunity to globalize in the context of a new set of markets, new overseas marketing opportunity, and new kind of market. We would note that a lot of that has to do with the characteristics of the Japanese products themselves. They tend to be feature-rich. They tend to be very slightly priced at a bit more of a premium. And that they are also, as a result, less available to a emerging market, Chinese or Indian or African consumer than their competitive counterparts. Where is all that coming from, and why has this happened? Why have these competitive pressures, why have these competitive failings, I should say, materialized. I mean, so we would actually then tie a lot of this back, as was said, to what we'll call innovation capital or more broadly defined human capital. So as you look at spend on what we call the components of innovation capital, whether it's the hardware, it's pretty good, but as we get to things like the quote software, sort of the advertising and marketing research, education spend, employee development spend, organizational development spend, these things across Japanese firms and the Japanese economy as a whole, relatively modest. And I think there's certain issue here of how much investment has been made in the human capital that's necessary to take advantage of what was the historical strengths of the Japanese industry and its technology base. So there's that. There is the gender issue, so we note that, so that no need to say more. I think it's already been highlighted, the gender gap in Japan, relatively speaking, and the very low levels. And now, of course, we're starting to see more, as was said, but that was historically one of the factors. But also the entrepreneurial gap. So I think this one sort of really speaks to it, as we sort of say, what's the share of the labor force that are entrepreneurs? In Japan is one of those all-time low numbers, and sort of that the capacity for entrepreneurship, for innovation, is globally at a relatively low level, whether it's early stage or nascent entrepreneurship. And it's understandable. If you go to a Japanese school and you ask the students, do you feel comfortable being an entrepreneur? Generally speaking, the answer will be no. It's like they do not feel the system prepares them well. They're encouraged. They have many incentives to do something new and take the high wire approach of entrepreneurship. So, can this be changed? We actually believe that there are plenty of opportunities out there, and we would share the optimism that there is an upside for the Japanese economy. There's an upside which relates to the rethinking of meaning of innovation and human capital investments in Japan. It's as much about entrepreneurship and rethinking society to encourage it as it is about simply better training. So training alone, will do it. But if we translate that into what has to happen in the private sector, we would say that, first of all, there's plenty of global best practice that, in fact, is not being adopted by Japanese industry, whether it's about how to globalize or how to build best-in-class capabilities. Manufacturing is fine where it is, perhaps, and there's certainly more that can be done, but what about, again, the supply chain? What about customer relationship management and digitization? So we sort of note some of the more noteworthy examples of Japanese progress in companies like, I'll say, Rakuten. These are companies which have fundamentally changed their organizational model to resemble their global competitors, perhaps Amazon, but to also challenge the existing incumbent system. And now are potentially leading the way in things like drone delivery and digitization of their offerings. There's also, of course, an upside on next generation technology. Simply put, I mean, there's established and then there's frontier, and we think that the established just replicate what is out there in terms of best practice might be 2/3, but the new frontier is also 1/3 of the opportunity, whether it's big data or tech or advanced technologies. And finally, there is certainly something about just management, and this probably understates it because it's hard for us to put a number against it, but the competitive and fluid industry landscape and sort of the capacity to consolidate more that's there, but it's also as much about within the firms themselves, their competitiveness, their industry, their structure, their relationships. We've done a bit of quantification. And so this just takes a quick look at what we think this could be worth across these 4 industries and then extrapolated across the economy, something between 20 and 30%, 20 to 40%, sorry, of value-added growth across the next 10 years or so. So it's non-trivial in terms of the opportunity. And these are just a breakdown of where it is. So best practices, meaning for the manufacturing sector, rethinking the R&D process to become much more commercial, globalization strategies to reduce the features and to retune the features, I should say, operational excellence, meaning integrating the supply chain better, after-sale services is a revenue opportunity that typically is underperforming, and then next-gen technologies, technologies on the manufacturing side, as well as robotics and additive manufacturing. So for each of these, we have some estimates, and I'd sort of be happy to share. Again, it's all online at mgi.com. And I'll just close with one last slide, is that, again, we agree that the society and policies must adapt to support this transformation. The firms won't do it by themselves. So in many ways, we see movement, whether it's around new talent, sort of encouraging women Seniors, Japan already has one of the highest in the world, over 55 labor participation rates. We think that's going to still happen. We should rethink what we mean by retirement. Immigration, of course. Education, I think we highlighted this innovative and global mindset and an education to employment pipeline, related very closely to entrepreneurship. So the ecosystem that allows entrepreneurs to flourish, facilitates an increase in funding available, and promotes an entrepreneurial mindset. And finally, of course, market-oriented reforms around global standards, global trade ties would encourage that globalization part of the solution as well. So we think there's plenty of upside, but it is ultimately a challenge that not only firms can meet, but requires the society and policies to adapt as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all distinguished audience today. Much of my presentation will echo what has been said in the morning, and I will probably reconfirm what was said. So I would like to go quickly to save time. Perhaps the most important part of my presentation is this part. The views expressed herein are those of the authors, do not necessarily reflect the official views of the Bank of Korea in particular. It does not reflect the views of Monetary Policy Board either. We have other members here. I never asked whether they agree with me. So. All right, here's content, and let me directly go to the first slide. This is a growth trend of Korea along with the world economic growth trend. It's clear that the Korean economy has been affected by the global fluctuations. But I mean, the growth rate between Korea's growth rate and the correlation coefficient between Korean growth rate and world growth rate is definitely positive. However, if you look at the whole picture, then it seems clear that the Korea's growth rate has been declining while global growth rate is not. So when you think about the secular trend of the Korea's growth rate, the factors should lie in domestic factors rather than global factors. So this is very typical and standard growth accounting. Up to 2015, we used actual data, realized data. And from 2016, we used projected values. And it is clear that all three components, labor, capital, TFP, have decelerated in Korea. And looking ahead, well, it is probably clear that the contribution from the employment increase will be further declining and will go down below zero sometime later, given that the Korea's fertility rate is probably lowest in the world, among the countries with the lowest fertility rate in the world. And capital contribution is expected to decelerate as well, if not going below zero, given that the capital to output ratio in Korea has approached the levels of advanced countries. So what about the TFP? This is a black box. So it is very difficult to make prediction on that. But it is probably easy to say that the TFP improvement is virtually the only source of growth left for Korea in the future. However, its future prospect does not seem to be extremely rosy. Even though you can list up hundreds of different factors that would potentially affect TFP growth of one country, but the literature usually says that as technology gap vis-a-vis global frontier is narrowing, the speed of convergence is declining, and demography will definitely age in the case of Korea, which, if any, hampers TFP growth, I think. This is not, this is an arguable point, but I have seen several papers showing that empirically, aging hurts TFP growth. So if there's anything, then it will not work positively. So there's R&D stuff, and there's education stuff to potentially affect Korea's TFP progress rate. But let me skip them because others already talked about in the morning. And let me focus on the improvement of the institutions to achieve more efficient resource allocation, which seems to be the key factor that Korea should rely on. We don't have very many micro evidences on this, but it has been accumulating recently. And my reading of the literature using microdata in Korea is not really encouraging in this respect. Labor mobility has been rather significantly lowered these days. I mean, we just heard of dual labor market structure in Japan. There, I was surprised that the non-regular workers' wage per hour is higher than regular workers relative to their productivity. Is that your point? But in the case of, well, that sounds like very reasonable and in line with the economics principles. But in the case of Korea, we all know that the non-regular workers are paid less with low job security. So it does not seem to be matching economic theory. So there must be something non-economic factors going on in the case of Korea. And this labor mobility has been recently lowered for regular workers. And all these mobility issues is handed over to non-regular workers. So non-regular workers are easily laid off, and they are paid less. So that looks like we have a lot of inefficiencies in the labor market in Korea. And financial market efficiency is eroded by zombies like in Japan in the 1990s. And product market efficiency has been declining, mostly due to the entry barriers to many markets. So I don't have enough time to go over all the details of these papers. Let me just say that our TFP prospect is not that encouraging yet. But look at the other side of the same coin. I mean, having inefficiencies in this labor allocation, resource allocations probably imply that we have a lot of rooms to improve in the future. So let's take the positive view. With all this declining dynamism of the Korean economy, many Koreans are concerned about the possibility that Korean economy may follow Japanese tragic lost decade or whatever the name is. I'm going to say that that kind of concern is not completely groundless. There are some grounds. Here, some fundamentals of Korea are similar to those of Japan, with 20 years of lag. This graph is, I overlap the Korea's data onto Japan's data with 20 years of time lags. Therefore, Korea's 2020 is like Japan's 2000. Okay? And you can see the similarity between these two. So we are sort of following Japan with 20 years of time lag in terms of demography. And some other fundamentals, like industrial structures, are also very similar. This graph shows the revealed comparative advantages across the industries. The numbers are showing the SITC codes. And look at the Japan and Korea here. They are very similar, focusing on industry number 7, which is machinery and electronics. So, and there are so many other respects I can talk about that shows similarities between Korea and Japan, including language structures, including cultural backgrounds, and legal environment. There are a lot of similarities. But in short, this graph is a summary statistic of similarities between Korea and Japan 20 years ago. What this graph shows is that the Harder-Prescott trend of the nominal GDP growth rate with 20 years of time lag. So, I mean, when I first drew this graph, I was struck. I mean, this is so similar, and I could not identify which line was which country. So they were so similar up to 2010 in Korean data. But so far I have been telling you that Korea has been following Japan with 20 years of time lag. But luckily, recent episodes start to show some differences between current Korean economy with Japanese economy 20 years ago. So it starts to deviate. Korean economy starts to deviate from Japanese trend. Here, this period is a deflation period, and this period is reflecting the recent Abeomics performance. And Korea's performance is slightly above Japanese. Okay, the pace of this disinflation was milder in Korea in comparison with compared to Japan 20 years ago, while inflation in Korea has been lowered to a worrisome level since 2013. I mean, it persistently stay below the target level for the past 3 or 4 years. And this dissemblance between Korea and Japan may stem from differences in asset prices, especially real estate prices. Korea's housing prices have been rising roughly in accordance with CPIs. In other words, for the past 25 years. In other words, Korea's real house prices did not rise much, while in Japan, house prices were surging before the collapse in the 1990s. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are some differences as well. Okay, and many Koreans are worried about the whenever they talk about the Japanization possibility of the Korean economy, what they have in their mind is whether Korea will have such tragic bubble burst in the real estate market. That I'm not sure, but my personal view is that the probability is much lower than Japan 25 years ago. And regarding deflation possibility, well, there is no a prior reason, in my opinion, to believe that Korea should follow Japan into deflation. As far as inflation and deflation is a monetary phenomenon, well, I'm not sure, but some people these days are not confident about this last statement, whether inflation or deflation is ultimately a monetary phenomenon or not. But I was educated that way, and I still believe that way. So as far as this is a monetary phenomenon, then whether Korean economy is falling into deflation or not depends on monetary policy making. Okay. Yet the changes in fundamentals do carry important implications on monetary policy. The most important one is the decline in the natural interest rate, which increases the probability of hitting the zero lower bound. We all know about this, right? So here's the graph. Korea's nominal interest rate has been declining very rapidly. Well, when I was young, when I was a child, my mom used to deposit her money for 3% of interest rate per month. So 40% annualized in the early 1970s. It has been declining very rapidly in both nominal terms and real terms. And finally, long-term rates of Korea fell to the levels similar to those of the United States. To many people, this was surprising, but if you look at the Japanese case, then that is here, right? All zero. So if Korea is simulated to Japanese case, then who would know? So I wanted to figure out how much of this interest rate decline or natural rate decline was attributable to fundamental factors. So my co-author, actually, this is a high-tech modeling. So I asked a young guy to do this for me, who is my co-author, Dr. Kwon Gyu-ho. I borrowed his model, actually. This model is overlapping generations models with 80 generations from age 20 to 99. And we put in all the actual demography, evolvement, along with the demography projections in the future. Okay. Then the exercise, counterfactual exercise we did was to assume that for example, mortality rate did not change at the level of 1990. So if that mortality rate in the 1990 had been fixed since then what would have happened to our natural interest rate or more precisely, marginal productivity of capital in this non-monetary model. And this is the result, from the fundamental changes like mortality rate and fertility rate and TFP progress rate and relative prices of capital goods. The natural rate in our model was declining by 4.3 percentage point up to now, and expected to further decline by 6 percentage point for the next 25 years. Okay. Well, what's wrong with the fall of mortality rate? What's wrong with the longevity? Well, nothing's wrong, right? Nothing much wrong. But only when you are well prepared in terms of social security system and monetary policy making, it would not deliver too much harm to us. So we should be prepared in that sense. I wanted to know how much this demographic change would bring about to our economic environment. Okay, so this is the result for each. By the way, I was born in the 1961, and when I was born, my life expectancy was 55 years. So I should die last year. So since then, our life expectancy was increased 0.6, almost 0.6 year every year. So I mean, this is incredibly rapid longevity. Longevity may be a blessing if you are well prepared, but if you are not, then that can be a disaster. All right, so did I save too much time? Okay, well, here's conclusion. Korea's potential growth will likely continue to decline given the current demography and capital deepening. Not so promising, I mean, the TFP improvement prospect is not so promising yet, but again, it may imply that we still have a lot of room to improve. And the natural rate, too, is likely to decline in the future. The neutral interest rate for short-term safe assets, I mean, the model we ran was a non-monetary model. So that is not directly tackling the policy rate. Okay? So we have to do something more work to translate, from our model natural interest rate to policy interest rate. But the policy interest rate is short-term, and it is safe rate. So there's a lot of differences between those two concepts. That neutral interest rate for short-term safe assets has been estimated in Korea by some other authors. They consistently, well, there's a lot of variations and uncertainties and estimation errors, but it is somewhere around 1% or slightly lower than 1% in real terms. So if our natural interest rate continue to decline further for the next 25 years, then it is not going to be that surprising to see a negative region in neutral rate. So in order to avoid deflation that Japan experienced, one thing we should keep in mind is that we have to maintain inflation expectations from falling too much. And I don't, well, as a policymaker currently, I don't want to say that we have to raise our inflation target level. I mean, this is 2% target is mandate that is given to me. I have to observe that rather than saying that we have to change the target, right? But what I have to do is probably to keep the inflation expectations from falling too much. And prepare, probably we need to start to think about the emergency policy measures, including unconventional ones that the advanced countries have explored for the past 10 years. And of course, most desirable would be to improve TFP, which will alleviate the decline of the natural interest rate, even though I did not emphasize much about this part. Here's a TFP progress rate. Right? So if we can successfully enhance TFP growth rate, improvement rate, then that will alleviate the decline of the natural interest rate and thus reduce the probability of hitting zero lower bound. And I can list more than 10 different reform agenda to enhance our TFP, but all of them are not politically easy to carry out. So how to overcome resistance of vested interest groups is the real political question. And perhaps, as Adam mentioned earlier, we probably have to have more open mind toward foreigners and toward other interest groups. But that does not seem to be the case yet in Korea. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. According to my iPhone, it's not Galaxy 8. I'm standing in between you and your coffee or tea. The schedule that I have, I think we should have been already back from our coffee break. So I'll try to keep it as short as possible. This is all I'm going to say, so don't worry. And if you haven't already read the paper, it's in the binder. It's a very good paper. Dr. Cho and Kwon, they do a very nice job explaining the decline in Korea's growth rate, and especially using the growth accounting technique, explain the factors behind it. And then Dr. Cho, as he presented, mentioned the importance of total factor productivity growth. And that's also very nicely done in the paper. Then the paper gets into the allocation issues, perhaps inefficiencies in allocation of resources. And then finally, of course, the comparison between Japan and Korea is very useful, especially when it comes to monetary policy. But I started to worry a bit because you said your life expectancy when you were born is past your current age now. So I hope this decline in natural interest rate is not causing you nightmares. I hope you're sleeping well at night. And I think there's hope, and that's what I would like to conclude. But I'll make only 3 points. The first and the third one, they're very quick and simple. The second one is a bit tricky, and that's why I have a number of pictures for you to look at. The first one is about the point that total factor productivity growth is critical for Korea to resist this decline in the growth rate due to especially demographic effects. True, indeed, TFP growth is critical, but I think Korea should use all the ammunition it has against this decline in the growth rate, and that still means that the other 2 factors, which is capital accumulation and labor accumulation, are still critical. In terms of labor accumulation, you must have heard MD Christine Lagarde mention female labor participation. An increase of that certainly will make a big difference. It will not completely undo the demographic impact, but certainly reduce it significantly. And there are all sorts of other additional efficiency gains from that. One simple channel, and there are many others, is as more women participate in the labor markets and their dual incomes in a certain in a household, then it is easier for one person from the household to leave a particular job and search for another one, which would perhaps increase the efficiency of labor distribution in the economy. The other point that I would like to make is capital accumulation. Korea's capital to GDP ratio is high, 30% of GDP. But that doesn't mean that it should be lower. It could even be higher. And when you look at per capita income of Korea and where it wants to be, it does still need to invest a lot. So this 30% of GDP capital accumulation could be at least at that level and even more. And this is, recently we have seen offshoring. Part of this decline in investment in the country has been because of opportunities that are being created outside, which is fine. And there are a number of papers written on that. But perhaps some of this offshoring is due to some distortions in the local market. So if those distortions are reduced, there could be more onshoring, and there are some papers on that too. So that was my first point. I have time. My second point, and for that I have slides. Indeed, resource allocation is critical, and inefficiencies, possible inefficiencies are critical. So we try to look into that a bit more carefully using sectoral data. So I'm going to show you a number of things that we have looked at. And this is complicated because we looked at them and we got more confused. Maybe you have the answer, but let's look at these figures together and see what they imply. This is the first one. This is basically, if you take total growth, each column is average growth in Korea. The first column is 1970s, second column is 1980s, so on and so forth. And the left-hand chart is on industry, and the right-hand chart is on services. So when you look at this, it, by the way, this reminds me of one of my colleagues' socks. It's, he's British and he has these lined socks, and it shows also the, during the day, it starts high and then by the end of the day it comes down. And similar to that, in Korea in 1970s and 80s, the many different sectors were contributing to growth, both in the industrial sector and also services. But then after that, since 1990s, there have been a significant decline, and this decline has been quite steady, both in the industry and also services. So each color is a different sector. We use SITC 2 level, and we aggregated some, but roughly, this is what you get. What really surprised us is that if you look at, can you see it? There's this this blue, dark blue part, which used to be very small, but it is expanding, and that covers basically electrical, electronical, and transport equipment, which is completely opposite of what we have expected, because one of the key arguments of the slowdown of economic growth is convergence. As you converge, as some of your sectors converge, you see growth rates slowing down, and then you hope that other sectors continue to grow, so then eventually all sectors reach to the frontier. But what's happening here is that all the other sectors are slowing growth, but those sectors that we think have reached or are close to the frontier are growing the fastest and contributing to growth the fastest. So it's just the opposite of what we would have expected. So that really puzzled us. And then came the question, okay, well, is Korea using its resources and concentrating too much in certain sectors? It's a question. We compared it to a number of other countries. I just show you a number that is of countries that are perhaps comparable in terms of its economics to Korea. I'm running out of time. The theory is that as countries grow, specialization declines, but then as you become advanced economy, you start specializing more. And that's what you see in many countries. But what you see in Korea is that it has been specializing much more than all the other countries that we feel that Korea's economy is comparable to. Even Finland. And we put Finland in there because Finland's population is 1/10 of Korea. And even Finland is more diversified than Korea. And Finland is also important because you know what happened to Nokia. So could this be a source of risk for Korea? That's also a question. And then we looked at the allocation of labor and capital. What we found, I don't have time, so it's difficult for me to explain all these charts, but basically the bottom line is that we see that capital has been moving in the direction of those sectors where you see strong growth. And you see that employment is moving in the direction where you see less growth. So again, this has perhaps some reasons behind that, and we need to think hard about that. And that's why we started looking at labor productivity growth a bit more carefully. And you know, of course, there's a big important linkage between TFP and labor productivity, and the difference between them is explained by capital deepening, or the change in capital deepening. And there too, we've noticed that in 1980s, 90s, the growth rate, the labor productivity growth was really high in the manufacturing sector, but it declined. Still, it is highest in machinery, electronics, and transportation, but lower in others. And what is also interesting is that on the services sector, labor productivity growth has been okay, but it has not really increased. It has not really supported growth in a major way. Then we said, okay, is there hope? And the answer to that, I think, is yes, there is hope. We compared labor productivity in Korea to labor productivity in a number of other countries. So what we call frontier is labor productivity in the country which has the highest labor productivity among the countries that we have compared to. And according to that, Korea's labor productivity still has a lot of room to go, which means, yes, productivity growth now is low, but if you get the policies right, there is a lot of room. You can catch up. There is a lot of room to catch up. So I take this as a positive message rather than a negative one. And finally, and this is my last point, indeed, natural interest rate is declining, and that will probably continue to decline. So perhaps one of the most important things to do is to pay a lot of attention to inflation expectations. We did some work on inflation expectations, and this chart shows the key factors that affected the decline in inflation between 2012 and 15. There are 4 factors, and in fact, the fit is really very tight, very good. And you see expected inflation has much more explanatory power than all the others, output gap, all dependency ratio, and world oil price, when we look at the decline in inflation. Therefore, in Korea, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to making sure that inflation expectations stay anchored at the target. Thank you.
I really wish to receive cues and comments from the floor. but I have to close this session. Thank you very much. Why don't we give a big hands to this gentleman?